Welcome everyone. It's a zchut for me, a privilege and a pleasure to be able to share Torah with you on Leil Hoshana Rabbah. Leil Hoshana Rabbah is really such a magical night in its own sense, given the mini Yom Hadin of tomorrow. But obviously Leil Hoshana Rabbah is also looking forward to Simchat Torah, which gives it a lot of its energy. And you know, everything is different about our lives now. You think about, you know, Yamim Noraim and how different they were, and holidays in general. But when I think about Simchat Torah this year, I think perhaps more than any other holiday, it's impacted by what we're living through. And I'll explain what I mean. Simchat Torah for me, and I assume for most of us, if not all of us, is a celebration. It's a celebration of the completion of the cycle of the reading of the Torah. And we get together and we're proud of ourselves and we're joyous for what we accomplished. And this year, let's admit it, individually, it seems unlikely that each of us has heard all the parshiot of the Torah. Shuls were closed for some period of time. And communally, right? Let's say in a regular year, most people heard the cycle of the Torah. Okay, some people missed, you were sick, whatever, for different reasons. But the shul read the Torah every week. But this year not. In some communities, you know, Shmini through the end of Vayikra wasn't read. And poskim, it's interesting, when we got back to shul, poskim discussed and mostly paskind, there's no point in reading everything that we missed. And I'm sure that that's obviously the halacha. But in terms of Simchas Torah, what does that do to our feeling? What does that do to the celebration that we're supposed to feel at having completed the cycle of the Torah in a year that we have not completed the cycle? So what I'd like to do is deal with that issue, but deal with that issue through the lens of a really, really interesting part of Simchat Torah, and that is its development over the years. It turns out that Simchat Torah, as we know it, is relatively modern. It's not what it was. It doesn't exist in Mishnayos. It doesn't exist in the Gemaros as we know them. It starts to exist a tiny bit in the times of the Gaonim and then the Rishonim. And it turns out that a lot of the development of Simchat Torah as we know it is sort of our emotions overcoming what I would call the halacha. I'll give you an example. Most of us, I assume, when we come to shul for Kriyat HaTorah, let's say you go to a bar mitzvah, most of us are hoping there'll only be 7 aliyot. Okay? Now there are some hosafot. Okay, you know, there's a big family, you're happy for the people, it's an aufruf, it's a bar mitzvah, fine. But imagine if they told you, you know, we have so many guests, we're going to read the parsha twice, or 3 times, or 4 times, as we do every Simchat Torah. Not sure how excited we would be, right? There's a lot going on Simchat Torah that we'll see that seems to be different. You know, the 3 Sifrei Torah, where we read Sefer Bereshis from, we read a different haftarah than the Gemara paskins like, as we'll see. There's a lot going on Simchat Torah, and I want to claim, because I think it's true, that a lot of this is sort of in response to the emotions that we feel. Chazal allowed us to do certain things on Simchat Torah in response to our emotions. And at the end we'll discuss, okay, what should our emotions be this year? What should our response be this year? Should anything be different? Obviously not halachically, but experientially or emotionally. Okay, let's start at the beginning. There is a source sheet that you should be able to click on to look at the sources along with me. Just to start at the beginning, in the first source in Shulchan Aruch, Xayim Siman Tuf Reish Sadi Test Seif Aleph, the Ramah says, V'korin Yom Tov Ha'acharon Simchat Torah. We refer in Chutz La'aretz to the last day, the 9th day, as Simchat Torah. Why? Lefi shesmeichin va'osin bo seudat mishteh ligomra shel Torah. Because we're happy, because we're celebrating the completion of the reading of the Torah. It's interesting. The name Simchat Torah is in response to what we do. Right? It's not really, it was never the name of the holiday, but since we're completing the Torah and since we're responding and we're joyous to it, we're joyous over the occasion, we refer to it as Simchat Torah. Now, what's the source for celebrating the completion of the Torah, or really the completion of any siyum, of any piece of Torah? So all the Rishonim point to a Medrash Rabbah and Shir Hashirim, which is source number 2. The Medrash is talking about, we know the famous story of Shlomo HaMelech. God appeared to him in a dream, offered him whatever he wanted. Shlomo HaMelech asked to be the Chacham Mikal Adam. So the Medrash says, Miyad vayikat Shlomo v'hinei chalom. He wakes up. Amar Rav Yitzchak, Chalom haya omeid al kano chamor nohek v'hu yodea ma nohek. He heard a donkey braying and he understood him. Dr. Doolittle. Tzipor mitzotzeit v'hu yodea ma mitzotzeit. He understood it. Miyad vayavo Yerushalayim vayamod lifnei Aron Brit Hashem vayal olot vayas shlamim vayas mishtel l'chol avadav. Shlomo HaMelech makes a huge party for his household, for his servants. Amar Rav Elazar mikan she'osim seuda ligomra shel Torah. This is the source. Shlomo HaMelech made a seuda to celebrate his newfound intelligence. This is the source for the seudot that we make for the siyum generally, but also it's sourced in terms of Simchat Torah as well, right? We finish the Torah, we have an obligation to celebrate based on Shlomo HaMelech having done it, and so we do. Great, that's what we know. But it turns out, even before there was such a thing as Corona, it wasn't always the case that we were completing the cycle of the Torah. In fact, as most of us know, the yearly or the annual completion of the cycle of the Torah was not the original minhag. We have sources in the Gemara, we'll see in the Rambam as well, that the original cycle of reading was 3 years, not 1 year. So what did Simchat Torah celebrate when you didn't finish the Torah every year? So for example, the Rambam in source number 3, in Hilchot Tfilah, Perek Yud Gimel Halacha Aleph says as follows: Haminhag hapashut b'chol Yisrael shemashlimin et haTorah b'shana achat. Says the Rambam, the minhag, it's not a din, the minhag seems to minhag in all of Yisrael to read the Torah on an annual cycle. Matchilin b'Shabbat she'achar Chag HaSukkot, as we do, v'korin b'Seder Breshit, b'Shniya Eila Toldot, interesting, we call it Noach, b'Shlishi Vayom Hashem al Avram, we call it Lech Lecha, v'korin v'holchin ala Seder Hazeh ad shegomrin et haTorah b'Chag HaSukkot, all the way like we do it. The Rambam points out, v'yesh mi shemashlim et haTorah b'shalosh shanim ve'eino minhag pashut. Says the Rambam, even in my time, in the 1200s, there are still people who work on a 3-year cycle. The Rambam disagrees with that minhag. But in the Gemara, in Eretz Yisrael, they worked off a 3-year cycle. In Bavel, they worked off a 1-year cycle. Now, Bavel kind of took over, and that's the minhag that we know. But at least going back to the times of the Amoraim, there was a Simchat Torah that didn't necessarily celebrate the completion of the Torah. And we might want to look to that as a model for how we would behave this year. Now, people say simply, okay, they really only had Simchat Torah every 3rd year. Okay, so what did they have the other years? Well, it turns out that well before it was Simchat Torah, there was a holiday called Shmini Atzeres, which has nothing to do with the reading of the Torah. Source number 4, from the Parshas HaMoados in Vayikra Perek Chaf Gimel, the Torah says about Sukkot, Shivat Yamim Takrivu Ishel Hashem, Bayom Hashmini Mikra Kodesh Yihiyeh Lachem. On the 8th day, there's a special Yom Tov. V'ikravtem Ishel Hashem Atzereti, Kal Melechet Avodah Lo Ta'asu. Sukkot is a 7-day holiday, not the way we think about it. Sukkot is a 7-day holiday, the first day of which is a Yom Tov. The next 6 days are Chol HaMoed. Happens to be there's another holiday called Shmini Atzeret, which falls out on the 8th day of Sukkot. It has its own laning, it has its own karban, it has nothing else, obviously. No sukkah, no daled minim. It's just as the Medrash describes, us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a time of love between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, so now, you had this holiday. Now, in Israel, it's easy because there's only the 8th day. In Chutz La'aretz, okay, there was the 8th day, then there's a 9th day, and the 9th day kind of turned into Simchat Torah. But in Israel, it's still only the 8th day. And to a certain extent, it seems to me that you had a holiday without a lot of content. I mean, there's great joy. It's just us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu and one karban, not the shivim parim kineged, the shivim umos ha'olam, just us. There's a closeness. But what were you going to do all day? It seems to me that Chazal superimposed this thing called Simchat Torah, it's not just me, I'm sure most people say this, over the day of Shmini Atzeres, which didn't have much in the way of content. Masha Lamaha Davar Doma, there's a holiday that we call Chag Matan Torah. But in the Torah, it's just Chag HaBikurim, it's Shavuot. It also doesn't have a lot in the way of content. There's no Seder, there's no sitting in a sukkah. And there too, Chazal kind of superimposed Nesinas HaTorah and Matan Torah over the day of Shavuot, much like Chazal did with the day of Shmini Atzeret. They superimposed the completion of the Torah, and that became sort of the focus of the day. Okay, now let's try to trace some specific developments within the day of Simchat Torah as they may apply to us. So the first thing is obviously, you look in the Gemara tells you what are you laying? What's the Kriyat HaTorah on every holiday? So source number 5, the Gemara in Megillah, Lamed Aleph, Amud Aleph, says as follows. Yom Tov HaAcharon, that's Shmini Atzeres, Korin Kol HaBechor, Mitzvot V'chukim U'Bechor. Okay, we read Kol HaBechor, a lady that we know. U'maftirin Vahi Kechalot Shlomo. Lemachar, the 9th day, which is Simchas Torah and Chutz La'aretz, but is what we now do on the 8th day, Korin V'zot HaBracha, we learn V'zot HaBracha, U'maftirin Vaya'amod Shlomo. And the Haftorah is the bracha that Shlomo gave at the dedication of the Beit HaMikdash. We'll come back to that in a minute. So here you have, okay, we're going to lane V'zos HaBracha on Simchat Torah. Now the question is why? Okay, what is it about V'zot HaBracha that makes it the laning for the holiday? Now you'll say, well, that's Simchat Torah, but it's not so simple. Again, all holidays have a special Kriyat HaTorah. They don't have the Parsha. The only time we lane Parshat HaShavua on a holiday is Simchat Torah. So it turns out there are two interesting suggestions in terms of why we read V'zot HaBracha on Sukkot. One we know, one I think is less popular. Look at source number 6, the Machzor Vitri, which more or less was written by Rashi, or the Talmidim of Rashi put it together, but that goes back to the late 1000s into the beginning of the 12th century. The Machzor Vitri says as follows. Yom Tshi'i Safek Shmini, right, the 9th day, which is the Safek of the 8th day, Korin V'zot HaBracha, Kidei Lismoch Simchat HaTorah, Shezachu L'Saima L'Simchat HaChag. Okay, Rashi says what we think, which is, it's not the content so much of V'zot HaBracha, it's that it's the end of the reading of the Torah, right? And it's Simchat Torah, so to be Misayim the Torah on Simchat Torah, what a great zchut. Keep reading. Shekein nichpelas simcha b'mikra b'shmini atzeret. Because Shmini Atzeret has an extra element of simcha as described in the Psukim, so it makes sense to add to the simcha of Shmini Atzeret. Lefi shesimchat hachag merubah. Okay? And now there's another explanation. Va'od kidei lismoch birchat hamelech libirchat Moshe. No, the second reason is nothing to do with the fact that V'zot HaBracha is the last parsha in the Torah. It's V'zot HaBracha is a bracha that Moshe Rabbeinu gave to all of Klal Yisrael before his death. That should be attached to the bracha that Shlomo HaMelech gave to Klal Yisrael. Why should it be attached? Last full line in the middle, in source number 6, Shebiyom tov ha'acharon hayta birkat hamelech, kimo she'amru chachamim, shehu chaluk min hachag shezakuk libracha bifnei atzma. Because we understand that the special bracha that Shlomo HaMelech gave to Klal Yisrael at the dedication of the Beit HaMikdash, the special bracha was said on Shmini Atzeret. So now the Kriyat HaTorah of V'zot HaBracha has nothing to do with the fact that it's the last parsha in the Torah. It has everything to do with the content. And the content is the bracha that Moshe Rabbeinu gave, much like historically, later on, a few hundred years later, Shlomo HaMelech gave a bracha on that same day. So there's something about the day that demands the laning of V'zot HaBracha. Just like there's something about Pesach that demands the lading of the Parshas HaMoados, and we read Pinchas for the Karbanot. It's not just the completion of the Torah, or it's not even the completion of the Torah. It is the substance of the Kriyat HaTorah. Okay? And the Avudraham in source number 7, now we're into the early 1300s, late 1200s, says the same thing. V'atam leparsha zo al shem sheshlomo hamelech beirech et Yisrael bishmini shel chag. He doesn't even mention the possibility that we read V'zot HaBracha because it's the end of the Torah. He says, no, it's the substance. We read V'zot HaBracha because that's the day that Shlomo HaMelech gave a bracha to Klal Yisrael. Now, just to put it in context, what was the bracha? So look at source number 8. Here now, we're in Melachim Aleph, Perek Chet. Says the Navi, Vayikahalu el HaMelech Shlomo Kalish Yisrael b'yerach ha'eitanim bechag hu ha'chodesh hashvi'i. Right, there was a celebration of the dedication of the Beit HaMikdash in the 7th month. We know that as Sukkot. Vaya'alu et Aron Hashem ve'et Oel Moed ve'et kol klei HaKodesh asher ba'oel va'yalu otam HaKohanim va'alviim. They brought it all up. Now's us. Yud Bet. Az Amar Shlomo, Hashem Amar Lishkon Ba'arafel. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, I'll dwell in the cloud. Bano baniti beit zvulach machon l'shivtecha ulamim. Vayasev HaMelech et panav. Vayivarech et kol kahal Yisrael v'chol kahal Yisrael omeid. This magical moment where Shlomo HaMelech blesses Klal Yisrael, and says the Avudraham, and to a certain extent the Machzor Vitri as well, that's what we're creating. We're recreating on Simchat Torah this magical moment where Shlomo HaMelech blessed all of Klal Yisrael. So to a certain extent, right, we're magic, it's great. It's true, this year we don't celebrate the completion of the cycle of the reading of the Torah. This year we'll focus more on the fact that Shlomo HaMelech blessed Klal Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu blessed Klal Yisrael, and that's the magic of the reading of the Torah on Simchat Torah. Okay, it's an okay answer, but I think we're still a little empty. We still, as convincing as I'd like to be about the laning of V'zot HaBracha not being the completion of the Torah, but being something that's essential to the day, still it feels funny. And especially since we're going to read Breshit right after we finish V'zot HaBracha. It's hard to see a reason to read Breshit if not for the joy of the completion and the immediate beginning of the new cycle of the reading of the Torah. But turns out that's also kind of a funny innovation. Right? Just opening up another Sefer Torah and reading another part of the Torah as the completion or the continuation of the reading, it's strange, and it turns out that too kind of developed over time. Fascinating Shibbolei Haleket in source number 9, also an early significant Ashkenazi source of Minhagim. Okay, here he is in Seder Chag HaSukkot, Siman Shin Ayin Bet. Listen to this, he says, Va'achar shehishlim kriyato ad la'inei kol Yisrael. How did it work? Somebody lanes the end of V'zot HaBracha. He finishes Leinei Kol Yisrael. Eino chotei miyad. He doesn't make a bracha, as we would normally do. Ela omdim kol hatzibur al ragleihem. Everybody stands up. V'hachazan ochei sefer Torah bizro'o. The chazan, maybe the Baal Koreh, holds the Torah. V'omer shlosha pamim zachinu lahashlim l'shalom v'nizke lahatchilu lahashlim l'shalom. V'onim acharav gimel pamim, and the people answer him. Va'achar kach Korin al pe breshit bara Elokim ad vayhi'er vayhivoke yom echad. They don't take out another Sefer Torah. The person out loud reads by heart Sefer Breshit. Why? Before he makes a bracha. Then he makes the ending bracha over the laning after reading the first part, the first day of Sefer Breshit, by heart. Why? Umasha korin al peh. Why do they read it by heart? Why don't they take out another Sefer Torah as we do? Lefi she'ein motzi'in shtei torot lekoreh echad mishum pigamo shel rishon. Because you don't want to take out two Sifrei Torah for the same oleh. Now, obviously, we have two olim. One is the Chatan Torah, one is the Chatan Breshit. Here he says we don't want to do it, and without reading it inside, the Shibbolei Alek, it says, by the way, there's another source for this. We did it in the Beit HaMikdash, right? In the Beit HaMikdash, as we all know, on Yom Kippur, the Kohen read Be'asor she'bechomash hapkudim, he read Acharei Mot, and afterwards, he read the second part, the Haftorah Ki'ilu, by heart, because they didn't want to have to take out another Sefer Torah. So it turns out, again, in terms of sort of halachic innovations, the original minhag was not to take out three Sifrei Torah. It was to read V'zot HaBracha and continue with the beginning of Breshit by heart. So that's also something that has been innovated later on. But the point is, again, it seems that even from the earliest days, if you're reading Sefer Breshit, to a certain extent, you're doing it because the joy lies in the completion of the cycle of the Torah, as opposed to the essence of V'zot HaBracha. Okay, so we have two explanations for the Kriyat HaTorah. One of them works great for us. It's not the completion of the Torah. The other one is what we know, the completion of the Torah, which is why the minhag developed to then read from Breshit right afterwards. Now, just as a side point, it's fascinating, it's worthy of its own shir, but I just want to share with you, obviously, Zot HaBracha is not just the bracha that Moshe Rabbeinu gives us. In fact, most of us know it better for the last 8 psukim, which is the death of Moshe Rabbeinu. Right? That's the, Zot HaBracha is a classic example of a parsha that most of us know huge portions of by heart, but couldn't really explain. The last psukim that we don't really know by heart, that's the death of Moshe Rabbeinu, that we understand completely. And as most of us know, there's a machloket in the Gemara about who wrote the last 8 psukim. The Gemara, and it's in a few places, but source number 11 has it from Baba Basra, Tes Vav Amud Aleph. There, Amar Mar, Yoshua katav sifro, ushmone psukim shebat Torah. Yoshua wrote the last 8 psukim of the Torah. Tanya commander Amar, Shmona psukim shebat Torah, Yoshua kitavan. Tanya, Vayamad sham Moshe eved Hashem, asks the Gemara, Efshar Moshe mate, v'katav Vayamad sham Moshe. How could Moshe write something that hadn't happened yet? He couldn't have written it after he died. Ella, says the Gemara, Ad kan katav Moshe, mikan ve'elach katav Yoshua. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Va'amalei Rabbi Nechemia. Either Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Nechemia says no. Moshe Rabbeinu did not write the entire Torah. The last 8 psukim were written by Yoshua. Amalei Rav Shimon, could that be? Efsha Sefer Torah chaser ot achat. Could it be that the Sefer Torah is missing something? Uktiv lakoach et Sefer HaTorah. Moshe Rabbeinu gave what we understand to be a completed Torah to Klal Yisrael. Ela ad kan HaKadosh Baruch Hu omer u'Moshe omer v'kotev. No. Till now, there's a process. HaKadosh Baruch Hu dictates the Torah. Moshe says it out loud and then writes it all down. Mikan ve'elach HaKadosh Baruch Hu omer u'Moshe kotev b'dema. Going forward, God says it, Moshe doesn't repeat it, and he writes in tears. Okay, different pshatim, he was crying, or he wrote it with his tears, but it generates an interesting machlokes. The Gemara says then, Kiman Azla, Hada Amar Rav Yoshua bar Abba Amar Rav Gidol Amar Rav, Shmone psukim shebat Torah, Yachid korei otan. Okay, there's something different halachically about the last 8 psukim in the Torah. We could talk about this all night. There are 5 shitot and rishonim about what it means, Yachid korei otan. Very quickly, I put them on the sheet very quickly. Rashi says, Yachid korei otan, klomar ein mafsikin bahan. Right? There's no such thing. The last 8 psukim cannot be broken up into multiple aliyos. Tosfos quotes a shita from Rav Meshulam that the person who gets the aliyah is supposed to lane. Yachid karei otan, it's not supposed to be an oleh and a bal korei, it's just that person. The Rambam has a fascinating shita. The Rambam says it means Yachid karei otan, you don't need a minyan. The last 8 psukim can be read by Yechidim, right? Many people disagree with the Rambam, it's fascinating. Another shita, found in the shita Mekubetzet, says as follows. The last 8 psukim, Eino rashai ligmor ad sof haTorah shenimtza korei ma shekatav Moshe im ma shekatav Yoshua ela mafsik va'oleh acher. Okay, you can't combine aliyot, not just that you can't make an aliyah in the middle of the last 8 psukim, but you're not supposed to attach the last 8 psukim to a previous aliyah. This we don't paskin like. Why? Because you should understand the last 8 psukim are different. The last 8 psukim are different in the sense that they weren't written by Moshe Rabbeinu, according to one shita. Okay? Either way, this should put a damper on the celebratory nature of Kriyas HaTorah and Simchat Torah, given that Moshe Rabbeinu is the greatest human being who ever lived. He didn't fulfill his life's mission of going into Eretz Yisrael. So there is an element of dampening of the joy that we would normally feel. Okay, that's a side point, but it's fascinating in terms of how we look at the development. Okay, let's look at one other fascinating thing, and that is what exactly is it that we lane for the Haftorah, and why that would be. It's a fascinating thing. Look in source number 12. We already saw. You know what? Go back if you can. If not, I'll just tell you. Source number 5 was the Gemara in Megillah, Lamed Aleph, Lamed Aleph, that said the Haftorah that we read is Vayamot Shlomo. Vayamot Shlomo is the bracha that Shlomo HaMelech gave to Klal Yisrael that we referred to a number of times so far tonight. So the problem is, that's not what we read. We all know. The Haftorah that we read on Simchat Torah is the beginning of Sefer Yoshua. And we all know why. It's a continuation of the end of Moshe dies at the end of Zot HaBracha, and Yoshua takes over. Says the Or Zarua, Ukvar Sha'al Rav Amram, I'm in source number 12, Mipnei ma maftirin ba'acharei mot, Veheshivu, why is it that we read from the beginning of Yoshua, Veheshivu, Shekvar Shalu Kama Pamim Zeh, Ve'einan Yodim Mino Heikein. Nobody seems to know. We paskin against the Gemara. There's no other shita in the Gemara. The Gemara says we're supposed to read about Shlomo's bracha. They asked the Gaonim, hey, how come we don't? And the answer is nobody seems to know. V.A. Shlomar says the Orzeret. I have an idea. Ho'il v'chol yemot hachag maftirin bi'inyan hayom uvesimchat Torah misaimim sefer chumash v'korim inyan pitirat Moshe Rabbeinu. He says, obviously, Simchat Torah is the completion of the reading of the Torah. And it ends with the death of Moshe Rabbeinu. Lachein matchilin barosh sefer neviim. We start at the beginning, like the continuation of the story, beginning of Nevi'im. V'inyan ptirat Moshe Rabbeinu alav hashalom. V'ha'amadat Yehoshua b'mekomo. The Arzurah says it's no mystery. It must be that we want to start with we want to continue the story. The Haftarah should continue the story. The story is the death of Moshe Rabbeinu. The continuation is Yoshua taking over. V'gam Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yehuda Zatzal sha'alu mipnei ma no'agim lahaftir b'vayehi acharei mot Moshe vehishiv kevan shenohagu nohagu. It's interesting. He says that became the minhag. It shouldn't really be the din. And he says, Sheminhag mivatel halacha. A fascinating idea for some other time, perhaps. The minhag, the custom, is mivatel halacha. V'yesh lo ma shebimei Rabbanan saborai she'amdu acharei ha'amoraim hinhigu kain. Okay? He thinks maybe after the Amoraim, they introduce this minhag. V'yesh kach bi'adam ki lamdu Torah mipihem. And they had the authority because they had learned this from the Amoraim. So this is as clear an example as we can find of what I would describe as the emotion of the day almost overcoming what should have been the halacha. Again, the Gemara says the haftorah is the bracha of Shlomo. All of a sudden, people start asking, you know, in the times of the Gaonim, wait, if that's what the Gemara says, how come nobody does that? And nobody does it. How come we read the beginning of Sefer Yoshua? And the answer seems to be, as the Or Zorah kind of points out, well, because we're finishing V'zot HaBracha. Now, you could say, yeah, but V'zot HaBracha, that's not the real, we're not reading it because it's the end of the Torah. We're reading it because of the bracha of Shlomo HaMelech. The answer seems to be no. The custom seemed to have become that Simchat Torah is a celebration of the completion of the Torah. It happened over time. Again, it doesn't appear in the Amoraim. Here we see a suggestion that the Saboraim, who came after the Amoraim, must have got it from their Rebbeim, and that justifies this. But it seems like, you know, Klal Yisrael, the people, in a disrespectful way, the street, kind of determined that Simchat Torah is all about the completion of the cycle of the reading of the Torah, and much less, you know, the bracha of Shlomo HaMelech. And that takes us back to where we started, which is, well then, you know, what's our approach this year? It's hard to celebrate the completion of the reading of the Torah when we didn't do it. Not individually and not communally. And so I think, or let's say for me, I'm trying to find a way to adjust my approach to Simchat Torah to make it celebratory, but also more meaningful, and to acknowledge that things are different this year. It doesn't have to be sadder, but things are different. And in what way are things different? So let's start, by way of conclusion, in source number 13. This is a Gemara in Shabbos. It's fascinating. Gemara in Shabbos, Laman Aleph, Amud Aleph, which is very well known. The Gemara describes what happens after a person dies and the questions that he's asked. Amar Rava, B'sha'a shemachnisin adam lidin omrim lo. When the ultimate din, after a person passes away, they ask him, Nasata v'natata b'emunah, did you deal honestly? Second question, Kavata itim la Torah, did you establish regular times for learning Torah? Rav Yerucham Levovitz, the famous mashgiach, I think of the Mir, points out something fascinating. It doesn't ask how much time you learned. It doesn't ask if you're a Talmid Chacham. It asks, the Gemara, did you learn regularly? And from here we see something inspiring, but also a little scary, that the regular cycle matters as much, perhaps, as the quantity of learning that you do, right? In Shamayim, they want to know, was learning an important part of your daily activity, or in the case of Kriyat HaTorah, of your weekly activity? So how are we going to overcome that? How are we going to answer positively when in fact we couldn't do it? Well, the answer is obviously, it wasn't our decision. And as with so much of Simchat Torah, I think our subjective feeling, our connection, matters a lot. And here's the approach that I plan to take, and if it speaks to you, happy for you to do as well. If not, you'll come up with your own approaches. The early sources say, the Rambam quotes it in Perek Gimel Halacha Zayin of Hilchos Talmud Torah, Asei Toratcha Keva Umelachtecha Arai. Right? Make Torah the main part of what you do, and your work should be secondary. Okay, v'lo tamar l'chishe'efne eshne shema lo tipon. And don't say when the time comes I'll change, because you may never change. I heard from our Rosh Hashiva, Rav Lichtenstein Zatzal, the following idea. He said, what does it mean, asei toratcha keva u'malachtecha arai? What is a person who works 8 hours a day, maybe more? Okay, but he learns. He learns an hour a day, learns 2 hours a day. But how could that be? His job is obviously keva, and his Torah is arai in that case. Rav Aaron said it's not true. The analysis is not quantitative. He says it's qualitative. If the most important hour in a person's day is daf yomi, is when he learns Torah, says Rav Lichtenstein, that's Torah's chakeva. It's true, you may go to work for many, many more hours, But work isn't the main part of your life. We get to decide what's important and what's not important. And I think that opens a window to us to determine what we're going to celebrate. So it's true. We can't celebrate the completion of the Torah because we didn't complete it. But hopefully we did. Hopefully, you know, every week that we couldn't go to shul, we did Shnayim Mikra V'Echad Targum. Maybe we learned it to ourselves. Maybe we learned it with our families, right? Or maybe we couldn't, but we wish that we could. And now, instead of celebrating the completion of the Torah, to a certain extent perhaps, we want to be more somber. And we want to turn it into a kind of a tefillah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That next year, if He allows us to have shul every single week, we really will celebrate. This year, perhaps less so. This year it's more of a tefillah. This year it's more of a hope. Or we'll recommit to Kriyas HaTorah. Instead of, God forbid, it being something that we have to do, it'll be something that we look forward to. Maybe on Hoshanah Rabbah and then on Simchat Torah, our commitment to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is to make Kriyat HaTorah a more central part of our lives. To commit to Shnayim Mikra V'Echad Targum, to commit to some form of serious review of the Parsha every week. So that on Simchat Torah, if we're not celebrating what we finished, we're celebrating in advance what we plan to do next year. We're committing to what we plan to do next year. And it's interesting that Torah is supposed to be kavah, but davening is not. Last source number 15, the Mishnah in Avos, Parak Bet Halacha Yud Gimel says, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Hevei Zahir b'Kriyat Shema u'b'Tfilah. Okay, be careful when reading of Kriyat Shema and davening. U'kishe'atam mitpalel, al ta'as tfilatcha keva, ela rachamim v'tachanunim lifnei hamakom baruch hu. Don't make your davening into keva, which in this context means a burden, an obligation, something I have to do. Make it tachanunun v'tfilah. Make it something exciting. Make it something personal. Make it something that you're really reaching out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu directly. And I would suggest that that could also be our approach to Kriyas HaTorah. Don't make Kriyas HaTorah keva. Don't make it a weekly obligation. Make it, this Simchat Torah, something exciting, something we plan to look forward to. I don't know, to come back to an original example, that I could ask you or me to be excited about Hosafot. You know, when you get to the 12th Aliyah at a bar mitzvah, I don't know if we could be excited about that. We could try. But to be excited about Kriyat Torah, something we've taken for granted, something I've taken for granted my whole life. Of course, every week there's shul, and every week there's Kriyat Torah. And for whatever reason, we live in a world where that's been upended. And we need to take that into account as we celebrate Simchat Torah. And it has to be a feeling of what we've done this past year, but much, much more a prayer for what we want next year. The ability to go to shul. And if God forbid the decision is that we can't lane every week and we can't go to shul, a commitment to reviewing the Parsha, a commitment to discussing the Parsha, a commitment to reading it all with trup if we can't in some other way. But let's turn Kriyat Torah and let's turn the celebration of the finishing of the cycle of the Torah into something that we value much more, into something that we stop taking for granted, but something that we really, really want, and something that we're willing to celebrate, and something that we beg HaKadosh Baruch Hu to allow us to complete next year. Chag Sameach to all.